Welcome back to The More You Know. I'm your host, Drew Marine, and today, we're going to be talking about two of my favorite things, Magic the Gathering and Greek mythology. For those of you who don't know, Magic the Gathering is one of the most popular strategy trading card games, and it was made by Richard Garfield in 1993, and it is still running to this very day. It comes out with 4 to 6 new theme sets every year since 1993, and one of those sets takes inspiration from Greek mythology, and that's what we're here to talk about. In the Greek-inspired set of Magic the Gathering called Theros, there's all sorts of cards that take inspiration from Greek myths and legends. And there is even a set of gods that are inspired by the Greek gods, and that's what we're going to be diving into. And although I would love to compare all the powers that seeped in from Greek mythology about the Greek gods to the Theros gods and how similar and different they are, that would take too long. So we're going to be looking specifically at 3 gods from each pantheon. Those gods being Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades for the Greek pantheon. Then we're going to be looking at their counterparts in Theros being Heliod, Thassa, and Erebos. Using ancient Greek texts like Hesiod's Theogony, the Odyssey, and the Hymn to Demeter, we're going to be looking at the aspects of the Greek gods and seeing how closely they correlate to the Theros gods. And to draw comparisons for the Theros gods, we're going to be using the physical Magic the Gathering cards and Magic the Gathering lore about the gods. And first up, we have Zeus versus Heliod. The first thing we want to do if we want to compare Zeus and his powers and traits to Heliod's is we have to look at one of the most famous works that he appears in, which is Hesiod's Theogony. But who was Hesiod and why was his writing so important? So Hesiod was an ancient Greek poet in antiquity, and he wrote 2 very famous works, which are the Works and Days and the Theogony. And the Theogony is the one we're going to be focusing on because it gives great insight to the Greek gods, and especially Zeus, and how mortals should act towards the gods if they don't want to incur their wrath. The first similarity will be a similarity between all the gods, not just Zeus and Heliod, and that can be seen in the devotion mechanic and in the Theogony. What these two have in common is the devotion mechanic is basically the Theros version of worshiping the gods. And the Theogony goes into depth on how and why mortals should worship the Greek gods. The main reason is if you don't want to incur their wrath, you should worship them. So that's our first similarity, is that both of these sets of gods get worshipped. One to gain more power, that's in Theros, and one for mortals not to get smited, and that's in the Greek world. The next similarity is between Zeus and Heliod themselves. And this is one of their biggest similarities, which is they were both king among the gods. How Zeus became king can be seen in the beginning parts of the Theogony when he overthrew his father, Kronos, and led the rest of the Olympian gods to face the Titans. And when the Olympians won, the Olympian gods made Zeus the king among gods. How Heliod became king among gods is not nearly as interesting. He was known as the most authoritative and the most respected god in the Theros pantheon, so he was made into the king of gods by the other Theros gods, according to Magic the Gathering lore. Another trait they both share is their tolerance towards mortals. Both these gods' temper and tolerance towards mortals could change on a dime. This can be seen for Zeus in line 690 through line 710 in Hesiod's Theogony, where mortals have incurred his wrath and he rains down torment and earth-shaking destruction from the heaven using his lightning bolts and thunder and his power over the skies. It shows his tolerance for mortals when he slays his very own champion, Elspeth, right after she completed the final trial for Heliod in slaying a rival of his. He took her own weapon and killed his own champion. But that's really where their similarities end. As that can be seen on the Magic the Gathering card for Heliod, he is the god of the sun, which is less in line with Zeus and more in line with the Greek god of Helios. Both their godly weapons are very different. Heliod wields a spear made of pure sunlight, where Zeus wields the powerful thunderbolt. In conclusion, Zeus and Heliod have more aspects in common with their traits, like being king and their difference towards mortals, than what they really were gods of and their abilities and powers. Up next, we have Poseidon versus Thassa, the ancient work that will be used to investigate the traits and powers of Poseidon to compare them with the Theros counterpart of Thassa is another extremely famous Greek poet, which is Homer and his work of the Odyssey. Homer is one of the most well-known Greek poets of antiquity. Most people have read something of his works, be it the Iliad, the Odyssey, or any other of his famous epics. But the epic that is most useful to looking into Poseidon is the Odyssey, because Odysseus incurs the wrath of Poseidon during his travels home to Ithaca. And there is no better way to look at all the powers and traits of a Greek god than when they're angry. The first similarity of these two gods is that they are both gods of the sea. They both show immense power and control over their respective seas and oceans. For instance, Poseidon shows his mastery of his powers over the sea in Book 5 of the Odyssey. In this book of the Odyssey, Odysseus was allowed to leave the island that he was captured on by Calypso by the will of the Greek gods without Poseidon's knowing. And when Poseidon sees Odysseus once again on the open seas, Poseidon becomes extremely angry because he knows the other Greek gods allowed Odysseus to leave the island that he was captured on by Calypso, and so he whips up an immense storm and commands the waves to crash against the new ship that Odysseus is commanding to try to drown him so he would never be seen again. This is one example of Poseidon's power over the sea. And an example of Thassa's power can be seen in the Magic the Gathering lore. In the lore, she commands the coastlines of the seas of Theros to create new coastlines wherever she wants, wrecking anything that stands in her way of a new coast. Be it a town or anything, it would get wiped off for her new coast and expansion of her ocean. And that is an example of Thassa's power over the sea in Theros. And although these gods both commanded the seas with their immense power and godly weapons, their weapons do differ. In Greek mythology, Poseidon wields the powerful trident to command and shake the seas of the earth. And in the Theros mythology, Thassa commands the seas with a bident instead of a trident. That is one way they differ. Their godly weapons are similar but different, one being a trident, 3 prongs, and the other being a bident with 2 prongs. Another trait they both share is they both can be wrathful when they get disrespected. This can be seen in Book 9 of the Odyssey, when Odysseus blinds one of the sons of Poseidon, Cyclops, Polyphemus. Odysseus incurs even more wrath from Poseidon, and Poseidon tries everything in his power over the seas to delay Odysseus from returning home until he is the last member of his crew, stricken with grief on the request of Polyphemus. And Thassa's wrath is incurred when somebody steals her godly weapon. The merfolk named Kiora tricks the god and steals the bident and disappears without a trace. Thassa vows to kill this thief and return her Biden to her rightful side and would not stop until this thief was caught and killed. As another way they are similar, they both can be extremely wrathful when disrespected. In addition, both of these gods prefer to dwell in their seas instead of their godly pantheons. Poseidon, he prefers to be in the sea over drinking in Mount Olympus, and for Thassa, she prefers to be in her oceans and seas instead of Theros' place of rest being Nyx inside the skies and stars. The final difference is how these gods appear to mortals. One appears more in a human form, that being Poseidon, where Thassa, as you can see in the art, takes on more of a form of a merfolk. Those are the similarities and differences between Thassa and Poseidon. And now, finally, we move on to our last pair of gods, being Hades and Erebos.
The pairing of Hades and Erebos is going to be the hardest to compare and contrast because Hades does not really have much of a role in Greek mythology. His role is basically to sit in the underworld and greet the dead souls into his kingdom. And there's not many works in Greek antiquity that Hades is shown in that we could use to compare and contrast with Erebos. But there are some. And the ancient work that will be used to compare and contrast Erebos and Hades will be the Homeric hymn to Demeter. One trait both of these gods do share is they're both manipulative. This can be seen for Hades in the hymn to Demeter when he abducts Persephone to become his wife. In the hymn, Hades is riding his chariot in the underworld and spots a fair maiden, the daughter of the goddess of the harvest, Demeter, and a goddess herself, Persephone. He takes Persephone and drags her into the underworld to become his wife. Demeter then searches for years, neglecting her godly duties, to find her daughter, Persephone. And once she figures out that Persephone is in the underworld, Hades uses his manipulation to get Persephone to stay for half the year in his domain, and for the other half of the year, Persephone gets to live among the gods with her mother Demeter on Mount Olympus. He does this by manipulating the rules of his domain. In his domain, if somebody eats the food of the underworld, they must stay in the underworld. And Persephone does eat the food of the underworld, a pomegranate, and she eats 6 seeds of it, and that is why she stays for half the year in the underworld. How Erebos uses his manipulation is a little bit different. He does manipulate his rule and authority in the underworld. Instead of manipulating his rule for his own gain, he manipulates it to help others and defy the will of the Theros pantheon. But that's about all the similarities the two have in common. There are a lot of differences, though. For instance, the role that Erebos plays in the underworld is much more significant than the role Hades plays. For Erebos watches over the souls of the dead in Theros, where Hades more of just sits in his castle and greets the souls of Greece to his domain. And the things that they're associated with are very different, where Hades is associated with the pitchfork and the helm of invisibility and the cornucopia. Erebos is associated with his whip, which is his godly weapon. But there is one last thing that they do have in common, which is both their realms are associated with wealth. In Greek antiquity, the underworld was thought to give wealth with crops back to the people of Greece, and the realm of the underworld in Theros is literally littered with gold and is thought to be the wealthiest place in Theros. Those are the similarities and differences that can be seen between Hades and Erebos. The reason why we've been looking at the similarities and differences of each of these gods is because it's important to separate the truth from the ancient Greek world of the gods to the pop culture world of the Theros gods. In addition, why this is interesting and important to look at is that pop culture is a way for the masses to learn about Greek antiquity. By having accurate information in pop culture of how the Greek pantheon works, it helps give people an insight into what it might have been like to live in the time of ancient Greek gods. Even if it's just a small glimpse, pop culture helps to grab the attention of the audience and can lead people to further investigate what is true and what is made up about the subject they were inspired to learn about. Just like this podcast has done for this episode, we dive deep into these three sets of gods because it gave us insight into how much this branch of Magic the Gathering pop culture took from Greek antiquity and mythology. This podcast was brought to you by yours truly, but I have to acknowledge the other works that helped make this podcast happen. For along with the ancient authors from Greece, we have two scholarly sources that helped inspire this episode of the podcast. Those authors being Judith Maitland, who wrote Poseidon's Walls and a narrative complex in the Homeric Iliad, and Shirley Darkus Sullivan, who wrote The Mind and Heart of Zeus in the Poetry of Hesiod. Both these scholars helped me get an insight into Poseidon and Zeus and their traits and helped make this podcast happen, along with the ancient Greek authors and the lore writers of Magic the Gathering and the physical cards themselves. So that's our podcast today. Join us next time on The More You Know.